Hello, I'm Kads, and welcome to today's video. We're back in action. I want to say I'm at like 95-ish%, so feeling good, feeling up to it, so let's get into today's topic. So of course, we're going to be talking about the Fragment summon that just began for Ugir the Wyrmeater, which is a very interesting name. Ugrin tribes. Let's go to the index so we can actually see his stats. So, very interesting champion. It is kind of nice that we are getting more champions, legendary specifically, in the Ugrin tribes, because as you can see, it is one of the least populated, least fleshed out factions. So that is nice that we're getting another addition. So we have here a Spirit Affinity HP based champion here, Ugir the Wyrmeater. So for starters, the base stats are pretty appreciable. 22,000, almost 23,000 on the HP, which is fairly high even for an HP based champion. Good defense, just under 1300, 105 base speed, so pretty decent. A little faster than normal, I would say, compared to average. Base accuracy of 20 compared to 0 for most champions, as well as an extra 10 resistance. Every champion in the game has 30 resistance to start, so he has an extra 10 at 40. Now, what does this guy do? He is kind of anti-reviver, which is the current meta for sure. That's definitely a lot of... We're in the buff meta, and we're in the reviver meta for sure, just because of the problems induced by polymorph, meaning it is very difficult / impossible in some instances to actually use debuffers and buff strippers and stuff like that in order to get rid of buffs. Therefore, buffs are more potent and stronger in the current meta. So in terms of his kit on the A1, attacks one enemy, 100% chance when booked of stealing a random buff from the enemy, and also places block buffs after that steal happens. Obviously, if they have block debuffs remaining after it, the block buffs will not land. But if you steal anything else, then you will apply block buffs. This is actually similar to another champion in the game, Basilius Roanus from the High Elves, except that his condition is that they have to have no buffs remaining afterward in order to do this. So it's actually a slight upgrade where you get block buffs regardless of whether or not they have more buffs afterward. On the A2, this is going to be his bread and butter ability, where it's an AoE attack, 3-turn cooldown, 100% chance when booked of removing all buffs from all enemies, so a full buff strip, and then places the big version of weaken for 2 turns. We'll come back to this later. On the A3, it is an AoE buff ability where he places increased accuracy on all allies for 2 turns, and if it's a defensive base champion, or I guess if their defense is higher than their attack, then he places increased defense, and if their attack is higher than their defense, then he places increased attack. So it's an either or thing on a 3-turn cooldown when booked. So this is not as good as Mithrala, for example, who just places both, but he kind of does place what you need in the moment, so he can be good for setting up bomb champions, increased accuracy, increased attack, really solid buffs like Yoshi the Drunkard and other champions of that ilk. But more importantly, he can also be a defensive buffer, so increased defense and increased accuracy in case you're running like a Ragash or a Stultus, someone who needs some accuracy but also increased defense. Now on the passive here is where we get to the anti-reviver synergy, where whenever an enemy is revived, it instantly activates his A2, the buff strip and weaken placing. And if they're revived specifically from the Lizardman faction, i.e. Pytheon, who's probably the most likely candidate or target for this type of ability, it cannot be resisted. So it is on a 1-turn cooldown when booked, meaning that I believe he just needs to take a turn and thus he can do it again. So it's kind of hard to imagine this working, but this is actually very, very strong against Pytheon. Obviously cannot be resisted, but more importantly, it's powerful against Duchess, because you're stripping off the veil and the continuous heal, placing a weaken, and they still have like no turn meter after the revive. It's good against Mighty Uko, who revives with block damage. Blind Seer, same thing, reviving with block damage. Elva, who also revives a single target but still revives them with a veil. So you're capable of just stripping the veils off, stripping the block damage off, stripping off whatever buffs they come back with, and you place a weaken, meaning that they can be targeted because you're getting rid of veils, or they can just be easier to kill because they have weaken on them. So he's definitely stronger than the kit reads just because of the current meta. But obviously he is extremely susceptible to polymorph himself because he's removing buffs. And until they do the nerf coming next year, I think in January, he's going to be just like any other buff stripper who is guaranteed most likely to be polymorphed if there's a couple of instances on the enemy team. So overall, I give him somewhere in the B range. I don't know if I put the plus or the minus. Maybe we just go with B. but he's B tier, he's niche, he is meant to counter the Reviver meta that we have going on right now, Reviver buffer meta specifically, and so he does fill that role excellently, but he's at risk of getting polymorphed just like any other buff stripper, so we might not necessarily see his full power in the meta until polymorph is changed. So right off the bat, should you go for him? That's up to you, as always. I think he's going to be more useful than he seems in the future, but there's also a chance that the meta will shift after polymorph is nerfed, and we won't necessarily need him specifically to counter Reviver and buffing meta, which is not to say that he'd be useless if the meta shifted, because he'd still do a great job against the Revivers that I mentioned, or any Reviver, to be honest. And so he'll still have a place, but he might not be as integral to the meta going forward. So if you are one of the few people interested in pursuing him, let's talk about his fusion and hop over to the fusion plan spreadsheet, which will be linked as always in the description box down below if you want access to the spreadsheet, where you can see this layout as well as all the previous ones dating all the way back to the lovely Pythion Fragment Summon event. So we have your pretty typical fusion minus one thing that we'll talk about, but you have your 4 dungeon split, you have 2 classic arena tournaments, you have a champion training tournament, 2 dungeon divers, 3 art enhance, 1 champion training event, and 1 summon rush. And of course, the one thing that is missing from this is the champion chase, which does not mean that there is no champion chase. It just means that it is not associated with the fusion or getting fragments for Ugir. Now, this is not the first time we've seen this. I believe if we scroll down, we can actually see that for Great Hoof Loriaka, regarded as one of the worst fusions of the entire year, we also did not have a champion chase associated with her fusion. Again, the champion chase is still going to happen, most likely as well going to be 2 times ancients, I believe. That's where we should be headed, but it won't be associated with the fusion, meaning that you won't get any fragments. And they didn't compensate, unfortunately, by adding more fragments to the fusion. They just removed the 20 that's usually up for grabs there. So instead of there being 130 up for grabs in total, meaning that you'd have to choose between you'd have to mix and match between the champion chase and the summon rush to get all the way up to 100. In this case, there's 110 fragments in total, 10 of which are most likely inaccessible by winning the champion training tournament. So you have to do everything to get all 100 fragments, which can definitely be a disincentive for a lot of people pursuing the fusion. Aside from that, we are starting the fusion off hot because we're going right into the overlap of champion training with the spider tournament. So we're leading off with a pinch point, as well as the other pinch point down the road where we have champion training overlapping entirely with Ice Golem, and then a little bit of Fire Knight at the tail end. And for those who are less familiar with the format of the spreadsheet, I always like to go through it, and I highlight all the milestones for each of the events and tournaments based on what they are. An asterisk means that it's an estimated or approximate value, and I update that or remove the asterisk once we know the final value. I have a pretty good feel of what the values are going to be based on historical precedent, but nonetheless, I still like to be open and honest and say it's predicted until I know exactly what it is. For example, we do know the values for the Dungeon Divers as well as the, let's do it live here, champion training event. As I mentioned earlier, you do have to do everything in order to complete this, which does unfortunately include the summon rush. However, because this is a fragment summon, I'm expecting to see a top milestone of around 3,000 points, just like Timit. They usually do this for the, let's say, more underwhelming champions. The ones that are more desirable, like Newt and Pythion, are usually the higher milestones of like 4,925 or 4,500 or something on the order of 9 to 10 sacreds, at least in the modern era. But for these that are less popular, and I could definitely understand that a lot of people would be skipping this one in particular, we typically see it around 3,000 or 3,500 worst case. In addition to that, I do also like to highlight at the bottom here my personal energy plan for how I'm going to be allocating my energy during the course of the fusion, which pretty much just ties to the events tournaments going on. And then, of course, it's not relevant to this particular style, but I do like to highlight the potion keeps and what day they're open, because for traditional fusions, it is helpful to be aware of the potion keep dates, just in case you need to top up on something. As far as current events going on in the game, it did already mention that the Dungeon Divers is live, and we have the unfortunate milestone of 3,700 over the course of 3 days, which is pretty dicey, but nonetheless doable. It's going to probably cost some excess of energy. We have the champion training event, and I must admit that this is the first time that we've had 3 nodes, I think, specifically in a champion training event, at least that I can recall. So we have 3 of those. As you can see here, legendary tome at the bottom, which means that over the course of the next 5 days, I will be trying my best to get all the way down there. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of champion training recently. We had a champion training event last week, as well as the champion training tournament that basically just ended a few days ago. So I am not happy about doing more champion training, but nonetheless, it is part of the fusion, so we're going to get it done. And of course, for the tournament, we do have the Spider Tournament live, which I will be doing a little bit more of tonight to making sure that I get at least a third of the 2250 for the fragments here, and once it loads we can see that. But yeah, 750 a day is what you should target if you're doing this piecemeal, at least, to get to 2250 by day 3, which is my plan. And as usual, I do like to highlight my supply count at the start of the fusion. That way you guys can track that. Once I post at the end of the fusion, I usually post in my community tab a screenshot of the fusion being completed, as well as my ending supplies, just so you guys know how much it actually costs to do fusions, even on a free-to-play account like myself. So in this case, we are starting off with just under 40 million on the silver. Pretty impressive for myself because I'm a notorious silver spender. And then we're just over 2,800 on the gems. So most likely I will net even on the gems, maybe net positive, depending on how much energy is in the clan shop for the couple of weeks, as well as other sources. But silver will definitely go down as the fusion progresses, because we do have 3 artifact enhancements, and there's not really much of an opportunity to skip anything, unlike the Timit fusion, where I was able to skip both of the artifact enhancements, or 2 out of 3 of the artifact enhancements. So that's going to do it for today's video covering my fusion plan for the Ugir Fragment Summon event. One thing that I haven't been able to re-mention since I've been out with the flu for the past couple of weeks is that it is Movember, for those who are familiar. So this is the month where we grow a mustache for the entire month, and you make a charitable donation if you can to the Movember Foundation, which does do its part to try and support men's issues like mental health, which is definitely on the decline nowadays, as well as prostate and testicular cancer. So if you did wonder why my beard is gone temporarily, thankfully, and why I'm growing this horrible thing underneath my nose, that is the reason. As I mentioned, there is a charitable component, and what I pledge to do is $2 for every sub that I gain for the entire month of November. And so far, we're actually up almost 30. So far, we've generated around $60. We'll see what the final tally is at the end of the month. But so far, we've generated $60 that I will be donating on behalf of you guys just for subscribing to the channel. I'm not going to ask you guys to donate on my behalf, so I'm doing it for you as long as my channel grows, and it's already shown proof of that, and we're halfway through the month. So if you'd like to support the effort, then feel free to subscribe to the channel. But as always, if you are enjoying the videos and you do enjoy the content, then that's the real reason to be subscribing to the channel and liking the video if you want to do that one as well. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.